Alrighty, I have 10 o'clock. Just because we have a lot of things to get through today, I'm going to get us started, and people can uh, drop in as we're going on. But um, yeah, thank you for coming. Today's webinar is going to be about the floodplain management basics that all New Hampshire community officials should know. So I am Sarah Thunberg. I am one of the National Flood Insurance Program coordinators here at the Office of Planning and Development. I also have my coworker, Stephanie Frichette, who will also be presenting with me today. Um, so going over our agenda, we are going to be talking about types of flooding and their associated hazards here in New Hampshire. Then going over an overview of what the National Flood Insurance Program is, what the roles and responsibilities of us as state employees are, and what the roles and responsibilities of community officials are. Then we're going to talk about some of the floodplain regulations that are required for participating communities of the National Flood Insurance Program, as well as the floodplain maps, how to read them, where to view them, and go over a couple of mapping updates, and then end with some resources. So to start us off, I'm going to be talking about river behaviors and types of flooding. So here I have a picture of a river that is it's in Alaska, and there has been no human alteration to this river. It has been left to its natural flow. And what I wanted to emphasize with this picture is that rivers meander and they change over time. That is just how rivers behave. Um, in general, river bends get bendier over time. And you can see in this picture, it's very clear where the edge of the river used to be, which is this yellow line. And over time, it has pushed outwards, and this bend has gotten more extreme over time. And eventually, this part of the river um, will be it will kind of cut off and create an oxbow lake. But really what I wanted to emphasize with this is that it is natural for rivers to change over time. They do not stay in the same place. And so it's important when managing rivers that you keep that in mind. All right. So the first type of flooding or the main type of flooding people often associate or think of when you think of flooding is river or inland flooding. This is your typical flood when the river water level gets too high and it flows up and over the riverbanks. And Generally, this is due to excessive rainfall or persistent thunderstorms or snow melt, essentially anything that adds water to the system over a long period of time. And these river flooding events tend to be longer duration on this order of days. And because they tend to be associated with larger weather systems, that does make them a bit more predictable because those larger weather systems are a bit easier to see coming. And the effects from river flooding generally spread out along the mapped floodplain, making them easier to plan for because you know the areas that will be affected. And since it is along a river, this type of flooding can affect multiple towns and have a very large area of impact. On the other hand, we see a lot of flash flooding here in New Hampshire, especially up in the mountains in western New Hampshire. This is due to excessive rainfall in a short period of time, generally less than 6 hours, and it results in high velocity torrents after heavy rains that rip through riverbeds, urban streets, or mountain canyons. Um, and flash floods tend to be short duration, on the order of minutes to hours, and have a relatively small area of impact. However, that area of impact tends to be extremely devastating. And eventually, the waters from a flash flood will drain into the rivers in the floodplain, but they can originate from anywhere and they can happen anywhere. It's because anywhere it can rain, it can flood. And due to the fact that a flash flood can happen anywhere, it tends to have a bit lower predictability because generally they are caused by a couple of thunderstorms that could happen anywhere in a large portion of the state. And that does make them a lot harder to plan for. And I wanted to emphasize in this image here. So I took two images from two different flash flooding events. One of them was in Goshen and the other was in Alexandria. But they both show the devastating impacts that flash flooding can have. So the top image shows where the water had actually jumped over its natural channel and created a new channel through this person's front yard and exposed their foundation and collapsed a structure off of their house. And so this was an example of where a lot of soil was removed. And then the bottom example is a picture where a lot of soil was added. So this is a intersection at the base of multiple gravel roads in Alexandria. And over the course of 1 to 2 hours, there was 4 to 5 feet of sand and gravel deposited in this intersection. This is a stop sign, or the back of a stop sign. So you can imagine all of the space that was filled in by the sand and gravels through the flash flood. All right, so another type of flooding that we see here in New Hampshire is our coastal flooding and storm surge flooding. Um, Now, this is where inundation of land areas along the coast is caused by an abnormal rise in water level that can be due to a higher than average high tide, heavy rain, onshore winds, or all of it together at the same time, which can really exacerbate flooding. These flooding events tend to be longer duration on the scale of hours to days, have a large area of impact, pretty much the entire coastline. And generally, these ones do stay along the mapped floodplain along the coast and can be a bit more predictable because they tend to stay in the areas where we know will be flooding and also a large coastal storm would be easier to see coming in a forecasting sense. All right, so the last type of flooding that we can see here in New Hampshire, we haven't been seeing it terribly often lately, is ice jam flooding. And this is when a frozen river gets a surface of ice, and as that ice is either melting or something physically breaks up the ice, that ice turns into chunks that can pile up at narrow channels of the river and restrict the flow of water, which makes the water quickly rising upstream of that ice jam and flooding the surrounding areas. Um, because these are due to a random pileup of ice, they are very low predictability and have a variable duration. Essentially, as long as that pileup exists, the ice jam flooding will exist. And similar to river flooding, generally this will spread out along the mapped floodplains and has a large area of impact as well. And the picture I have here is a river up in Alaska where there was an ice jam just to the right off of the image. And over time, this series of images kind of shows how the water has spread out upstream of that ice jam. All right, so I'm going to let Stephanie take over to start talking about flood insurance and some of the community regulations and responsibilities.
Thanks, Sarah. So now that we know about some of the types of flooding, we're going to be talking about flood insurance in the context of the National Flood Insurance Program. Flood insurance is always a good idea to have since anywhere that it rains, it can flood. Every area does have some risk of flooding, whether that be a low, medium, or high risk. And if you live in a floodplain and have a federally backed mortgage, flood insurance is not only a good idea to have, but it is required. If a community is participating in FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, any resident or business owner is eligible to purchase flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program. Many people may not realize that flooding is typically not covered under traditional home insurance policies. But if you live in a community that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, flood insurance coverage is then made available to any resident living in that community, including renters. You may often hear of grants that are available after a large flooding event, but those often require a presidential declaration where flood insurance does not, so it provides coverage even in small events or in events where just a few properties are affected. The Lender Floodplain Requirements Act of 1973 is a law that requires lenders to require flood insurance on loans that are secured by properties located in a high-risk flood area. This means that flood insurance is required when the property is in the special flood area and has a federally backed mortgage. Lending institutions will utilize the FEMA flood maps and the identified special flood hazard areas to make this determination. And it's the responsibility of the lender or someone working for the lender to determine if a specific property is subject to that requirement. If so, flood insurance would be required for the life of the loan, and once the loan was paid off, the property owner could choose whether or not to continue having flood insurance. So we talked about some types of flooding, why flood insurance is good to have, but it's also sometimes required. And now we will provide some background information on FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP, including what it is, how it works, and what some of the roles and responsibilities are at the federal, state, and community levels. The NFIP is a federal program that was created by Congress in 1968. It is a voluntary partnership between FEMA and participating communities. We often refer to the NFIP as a three-legged stool, as there are three main components to the program in order to provide safe construction in the floodplains. And these three components are knowing your risks through floodplain mapping, reducing your risks through floodplain regulations, and insuring your risks through flood insurance. Even though this program is voluntary, the majority of New Hampshire communities are participants, and on the next slide, we'll show you a map. But for a community to participate in NFIP, they agree to adopt and enforce the local floodplain regulations that meet minimum NFIP requirements that are set forth by FEMA. And flood insurance is then made available for purchase for all property owners and residents, including renters in that participating community. In New Hampshire, 94% of communities are participants of NFIP and 6% are not. So it's great that we have the majority of our communities participating. This map was generated in December of 22, and it is still current today. Participating communities are shown in white and the non-participating ones are in red. If you're not sure whether your community is a participant or not, or if you're new to the NFIP, feel free to reach out to us and we can confirm with you. There are different roles and responsibilities at the federal, state, and local levels, so we'll go through each one. NFIP is a FEMA program, and they are overseeing this program from the federal level. So FEMA is providing national program oversight by making flood insurance available through insurance companies for property owners, residents, and renters in participating communities. They are responsible for identifying the flood risks through mapping the floodplain, providing guidance on safe development and construction in the floodplains, as well as monitoring participating communities to ensure compliance with the program. The NFIP is implemented at the state level by our office, which is the Office of Planning and Development, and we are the state coordinating office of NFIP. So here at the state level, we provide technical assistance to all stakeholders, including answering questions from community officials, surveyors, engineers, developers, residents on issues related to mapping updates, understanding requirements for development or activities proposed in the floodplain, updating ordinances to include the minimum NFIP language. We also provide education and outreach materials and other resources such as model floodplain regulations, fact sheets, and sample permits. We also provide assistance after a disaster when rebuilding is occurring and making sure that the minimum NFIP requirements are still being met. When mapping updates are coming up for communities, we provide oversight of the process and communicate with municipalities to make sure that their zoning ordinances adequately address NFIP compliant language. So we conduct ordinance reviews, provide guidance on the state model ordinance, and assist communities to make sure that you're staying in compliance with the program. And at the community level, as a participant of NFIP, your community would be responsible for understanding your floodplain regulations and understanding how to use the FEMA floodplain maps, ensuring that local permits are applied for all development in the special flood hazard area, reviewing and processing permit applications for development that's occurring in the floodplain, ensuring any floodplain development is built according to approved permits and floodplain regulations, and taking action to correct any violations if and when they occur. To help communities document these permitting processes, our office has developed a fact sheet called Guidance and Best Practices for an Effective Local Floodplain Management Program. This document provides guidance to communities on who and what should be involved in each process. And to accompany that guidance document, we've also developed a sample floodplain development administrative procedures for local communities. There's both a coastal and a non-coastal version for a community to adopt. And the purpose of these administrative procedures is to ensure that the community's adherence to their regulations, to maintain consistency when there's new staff, and to remain in good standing with NFIP. If your community already has good administrative procedures in place, it is still recommended that they are written down somewhere for the same reasons that are listed on this slide. And speaking of which, we just wanted to let you know we'll be holding another webinar on December 2nd with a focus on best practices for an effective local floodplain management program, and we'll go through more administrative procedures, guidance, and resources on managing your floodplain program. And so we encourage you all to attend. We'll make this presentation available to you afterwards, and we have a link here for you to sign up if you haven't yet. It's also on our website. So now we'll be moving into floodplain regulations. And we're going to break these up into these three main categories. So one is the state model ordinance, which is a FEMA approved template, including language that the state offers that you can use when updating your ordinances. We also have the higher standards model ordinance, which is more stringent regulations that your community can adopt to go above and beyond the minimum NFIP requirements and building requirements that pertain to any development that occurs within the floodplain. One thing that's important to remember is even though we're talking about flood insurance, your community's floodplain regulations pertain to the entire community and any development or construction projects that are occurring within the special flood hazard area, regardless of whether or not a property has flood insurance. So your community's floodplain regulations apply to the entire area. It can be a common misconception that the regulations only apply if you have flood insurance, which is incorrect. Your community's floodplain regulations apply to all development, no matter if the property owner has a current flood insurance policy in place or not. So depending on your community's flood zone, there's certain language that must be incorporated into your floodplain ordinance. Our office has templates that you can use to make sure that you're including the correct language, that it is compliant with NFIP regulations. Here we have an example of a state model ordinance that's already been approved by FEMA, and these are available upon request. So just let Sarah or I know and we can send you the language. We also have more information about the state model ordinances on our website. So here's a link where you can read more about floodplain regulations. And again, if you'd like a copy of one, they are available upon request by contacting Sarah or myself. This is an application for a floodplain development permit. This is to be filled out by a community and the floodplain administrator to fill in the gaps. Local participation in NFIP provides flood insurance to individuals at a much lower premium than could otherwise be purchased through private insurance companies. And in order for citizens to be eligible for NFIP rates or for communities to receive certain kinds of federal money, the community must agree to meet certain floodplain development standards. And this application packet is a tool to ensure that those standards are being met. So please keep in mind that depending on the type of development, you may be required to hire a surveyor or an engineer to help complete the required forms. So I just wanted to highlight here that we do have guidance, templates, forms, checklists, etc. on the process of permitting development in the floodplain. As you may know, as part of a community's participation in NFIP, the community must adopt and enforce at least the minimum NFIP requirements. The two takeaways on this slide is that in order for a community to remain in good standing with the program, adoption and enforcement of the minimum floodplain management regulations is required. Going back to our administrative procedure slides, you must have a process for adopting and ensuring that the program requirements are being met. Enforcement of floodplain regulations will help communities minimize future flood damage, keep people and property safe, and keep insurance rates affordable for property owners. And the other takeaway is that it's up to the community to take full ownership of the floodplain regulations by understanding and enforcing your regulations. We have developed a basic floodplain ordinance that I went over in a previous slide, and that contains the minimum language, but it's up to your communities to understand and enforce the regulations that you have in your ordinance. The required NFIP minimum regulations are a good starting point, and they may be sufficient for some communities, but they may not be enough for other communities that have development or potential development at high risk of flooding. So you might want to adopt some higher standards because buildings can still suffer damage, floodwaters can extend beyond the floodplain boundaries on the map, and or they can rise higher than the determined height of the expected 1% annual chance flood area. Development and other changes in the watershed can change since the study was last completed for the existing floodplain map, such as changes in flood flows and flood heights. Some flood events exceed the 1% annual chance flood and will flood differently than what is shown on the floodplain maps. Increased participation in other weather-related events due to changing climate conditions are not accounted for on floodplain maps, and therefore, again, flooding will happen differently than what is shown on the maps. And communities have the option to adopt regulations that help address these issues and can reduce flooding damage with their community and reduce the impact of flooding for their residents and businesses. Our office has developed 2 documents that can assist communities with adopting higher floodplain standards, which go farther than the minimum standards. So first, we developed a higher standards model floodplain management ordinance and an accompanying notes document, which details information about higher standards and references sections of the state building code. In addition, the model ordinance includes administrative procedures, which are clear and specific for both the local permitting authority and the applicant to know and understand. And secondly, we also developed a menu of higher floodplain regulations document where the menu is set up so communities can pick and choose the regulations that work best for them. And the regulations are set up in 4 categories: elevation standards, preservation of floodplain function standards, substantial improvement and damage standards, and other. And our office is available to assist communities with selecting regulations that might work best for your community. And here are just some examples of what we've seen some other New Hampshire communities adopt for higher standards. So higher standards may include having prohibited uses and not allowing the placement of manufactured homes or businesses in the floodway, freeboard requirements where all new or substantially improved structures require 1 foot of freeboard, compensatory storage requirements where storage requirements apply for any development within the special flood hazard area, elevation certificate requirements. So some communities require elevation certificates for as-built elevation data, and regulation of the 500-year floodplain area, which is more correctly known as the 0.2% annual chance flood area. So just more on the higher standards, we have a guidance document, as I mentioned, from our website, which is linked here. And this document is the menu of higher floodplain management standards. It was developed in 2018. It was created to assist New Hampshire communities with incorporating regulations that exceed the minimum federal regulations. Certain higher standards can help a municipality earn credit through points through the community rating system, which is a voluntary incentive program administered by FEMA that an NFIP community in good standing can apply for to join and to actively participate. Municipalities that propose to adopt higher standards should submit a draft of the ordinance amendments to our office so we can review and ensure that a community's floodplain regulation still remains in compliance with NFIP. And here I will pass it back over to Sarah to talk about the building requirements.
Sorry, I started talking without unmuting myself there. All right, so as Stephanie mentioned before, so the New Hampshire State Building Code, or references to the New Hampshire State Building Code are included in the Higher Standards Model Ordinance Notes document. And last July, the State Building Code adopted the 2021 editions of the International Building Code, which includes the International Building Code, and the International Residence Code, as well as the American Society of Civil Engineers, Flood Resistant Design and Construction. And these codes include flood provisions which meet or exceed the minimum, many of the minimum NFIP standards, except for one notable exception is that the New Hampshire State Building Code requires 1 foot of freeboard above the base flood elevation for all construction in the floodplain, whereas the minimum NFIP regulation just specifies that it has to be at the base flood elevation. So we do have a statewide higher standard of 1 foot of freeboard. All right, so development in the floodplain. It is allowed, it just has to be done correctly, and it depends on the community's level of floodplain management regulations. So development is a very broad term in terms of the National Flood Insurance Program. Development is considered any man-made change in the special flood hazard area. This includes drilling, grading, paving, mining, excavation, filling, and storage of equipment or materials. So yeah, that is an expansive list that includes regular structural development as well as all of those man-made changes I had just talked about. So to build in the floodplain, so there's many different building requirements that are required per the NFIP. The main ones to be aware of are that the lowest floor, including the basement, must be at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And any enclosures that are below the base flood elevation must be flood-proofed, which is a certification that is filled out and filed with FEMA. And there are specific rules about what can constitute flood-proofing. Or below the base flood elevation, any enclosures must be designed and adequately anchored to prevent flotation, collapse, and lateral movement. Now, I know a lot of areas in the state are not actually mapped with the base flood elevation. Hopefully in the future, we will eventually, all of the areas in New Hampshire will be mapped with a base flood elevation. But until then, I'll talk more about this later, but there's a couple options that homeowners can decide to do. So if there's no base flood elevation and someone's trying to build development in the floodplain, either the homeowner can pay a surveyor to determine that BFE for that property exactly, or a less expensive option is that the community can require that lowest floor to be elevated to at least 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade. So that essentially means you take the footprint of the building you're trying to construct, and whatever the highest natural grade is, the minimum lowest floor height has to be at least 1 foot above that, or no, at least 2 feet above that highest adjacent grade. All right, so basements generally not allowed in the floodplain. And sometimes there's allowance for an enclosure below the base flood elevation. And that enclosure really can only be used for storage of equipment and materials. You can't really have any utilities in there. And it's generally supposed to be an unfinished storage space. Um, there are some building requirements for flood openings for enclosures below the base flood elevation. And that requirement is that every 1 square inch, or sorry, for every 1 square foot of enclosed space, you need to have 1 square inch of flood openings. And these flood openings are a FEMA certified and designed structure that is supposed to, in the event of a flood, allow water into the basement. Because what happens in a flood is you have your foundation and the flood waters kind of come up against your foundation. And if we don't let any water into the basement, the water pressure is going to crumble your basement. And so these flood vents are designed to, when flood waters rise up and there's a certain amount of pressure on it, the flood vents will open and allow water into the basement to equalize that pressure. And then generally you would pair these flood openings with a sump pump so that after the flood waters outside have receded, then you can pump out the water from your basement. These flood vents are not supposed to keep your basement dry. And that is a common misconception. So I just wanted to make that abundantly clear. All right, so there are also some development requirements for floodways. Stephanie's kind of touched on this earlier, but there's two types of floodways in the state. You have mapped floodways and unmapped floodways. And if you have a mapped floodway, essentially no development in that floodway is allowed unless you provide an engineering analysis that shows that the development would not cause any increase in the base flood elevation. It cannot even be an inch of an increase. And if you have an unmapped floodway, there's a little bit more leniency. You have to do the same engineering analysis, but it has to be say that the development will not cause an increase in the base flood elevation for more than 1 foot at any point within the community. All right, so there are specific requirements for manufactured homes and RVs. I'm going to start with RVs. So a recreational vehicle is allowed to be placed within the floodplain as long as it is on site for fewer than 180 consecutive days, or it must be fully licensed and ready for highway use. And that has a specific meaning, which should be outlined in your community's ordinance, which means that it is on wheels or a jacking system and is attached to the site only by quick disconnect utility types and has no permanently attached additions. If an RV does not meet those requirements, then whereas it's, for all intents and purposes, it is a manufactured home, and then it would have to comply with the manufactured home requirements, which are that the house or permanent RV must be elevated on a permanent foundation with the lowest floor at or above the base flood elevation. Per New Hampshire State Building Code, it has to be at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And it also must be securely anchored to that foundation site. So we get a lot of questions about what about the grandfathered properties, the ones that have been there for decades, if not centuries, and were existing before the National Flood Insurance Program. So there are two specific things that FEMA has kind of created to help allow those structures to remain, but eventually over time bring them into current day compliance. So that is called substantial improvement and also substantial damage. Essentially, the substantial improvement means that any reconstruction, rehabilitation, or addition um, or other improvements to a structure that the total cost of which is exceeds 50% of the market value of the structure before the start of construction or improvement. So essentially, if you make an addition that increases the market value by more than half, then the structure would then have to be brought into full compliance with the community's floodplain regulations as if it is new construction. Same thing goes for substantial damage. So if the structure is damaged by more than half of its market value, of its pre-damaged market value, then and the cost of bringing the structure back into the pre-damaged condition, if that is more than 50% of the market value, then same thing applies. The entire structure must then be brought into compliance with the community's floodplain regulations as if it was new construction. There are certain exemptions to this requirement for historical structures, but those historic structures have to be either in a state or national historic records. And the determination of the substantial improvement or damage has to be made by the community. And so you would be doing that while reviewing the building permits and the cost, the associated building costs, and make sure you compare that with the market value of the house, and just be aware of construction in the special flood hazard area. And if those costs are getting to about 50%, you just want to take a closer look and make sure that if the structure is going to meet the threshold for a substantial improvement or substantial damage, that you then make sure that all of the current floodplain regulations will then apply to this structure now. So there are different ways that communities can essentially verify that construction is meeting the NFIP requirements, but the easiest way to document your compliance is through what's called an elevation certificate. It is an as-built, it's a form created by FEMA that will show the as-built elevation data for all new construction and substantial improvements. And that elevation, as-built elevation data must be provided by the applicants following the construction. And FEMA's elevation certificate is the best tool for checking the final construction heights. But I did want to note that the elevation certificate will only certify the heights of that base flood elevation, the highest adjacent grade, the lowest floor. But it is ultimately up to the community to check those heights against your community's freeboard requirements to make sure that the structure is compliant, because the elevation certificate will only document heights. It does not document compliance. That is the responsibility of the community to verify. Now, I know these are a lot of building requirements, and there are certain times when development is just naturally going to come into conflict with some of those requirements. So you can issue a variance granting relief um, by the community from the terms of the floodplain management regulations. However, that is a local decision that must be based on 3 different NFIP variance criteria and 5 state variance criteria. Um, in general, variances put people and property at risk and are not advised. Um, and if a community does decide to issue a variance, documentation is going to be your community's only protection if that development does cause damage after a flood. So you just want to make sure that if a variance or if your community is considering granting a variance, you want to double check that it meets all of the NFIP and state variance criteria. There is a handbook provided by FEMA on the conditions and requirements for granting variances within the National Flood Insurance Program. All right, so I'm going to move us on to talking about mapping now, because I know floodplain maps can be very confusing. So, um, flood insurance, or the official term for the floodplain maps is called the Flood Insurance Rate Map, or FIRM. And they always come along with the flood insurance study, which is a report that shows all of the different elevations for the water surface. So you kind of have, they go hand in hand. You have the map and then you have the elevation package. Um, and I have several different examples of what these flood insurance rate maps can look like. Some communities have these very old paper copies of the flood insurance rate maps, and some communities have these newer digitized, a lot more detailed flood insurance rate maps. So eventually, ideally, everyone will be updated to these new digitized maps. And I know Belknap County is the one county in New Hampshire that still only has the physical paper copies of maps and doesn't have digitized maps, but the preliminary maps have been released, and hopefully within the next 2 years, Belknap County should be able to adopt the new digitized maps. So the flood insurance rate maps are used by community officials to determine which areas of the community are subject to their floodplain development regulations, which then determines what building requirements apply for development in the floodplain area. They are also used by lenders to determine which properties require flood insurance as a condition of a mortgage or other loan. And they're also available to be used by the general public to understand flood risk in their area. So, what do community officials need to know about how to use these flood maps? Um, so, it is important. Well, first of all, your community floodplain regulations are going to apply to all land areas designated as the special flood hazard area on the maps. Um, Also, understanding what flood zone a property is in, where the floodplain or where the floodway is located relative to that property, and then what the base flood elevation is, will all affect which building requirements apply from the floodplain regulation. Ultimately, it is the community in charge of determining which regulations apply to the to a proposed development, and then enforcing that development compliance through your local permitting and enforcement process. So what is actually shown on the maps? So we've talked about this base flood elevation a lot today, and that is the land area, or that is the height of the 1% annual chance flood. It's also been called the base flood or the 100-year flood in the past. And that essentially means that every year there's a 1% chance of a flood of this magnitude occurring. It is only a probability. It can happen multiple years in a row or multiple times in a year. And which is why FEMA has been transitioning away from the 100-year flood term to the 1% annual chance flood term. So it is the national standard for regulating new development and for determining flood insurance requirements. And the area that is mapped in that 1% annual chance flood area on the flood insurance rate map is called the special flood hazard area. That is the official designated floodplain for a community. So the special flood hazard areas on the maps are divided into different zones, and each zone will either start with a letter A or a letter V. A is inland, V is coastal, and then areas outside that are designated as Zone X, essentially meaning low risk. Right. So just to break up into a little bit more detail, so you have your flood zone starting with A and your flood zone starting with V, and then in each of those categories, there's there's multiple different types of flood zones. So starting with the least in depth to the least detailed to the most detailed, we start with Zone A. That is just a general outline of what areas are within that 1% annual chance flood area, but it does not include any base flood elevation data. So any development within these Zone A areas would either the homeowner would have to pay a surveyor to determine the base flood elevation, or as I talked about earlier, the community can require that development to be at least 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade in these Zone A areas. Now, the most common flood zone is what's called the Zone AE. They used to be called Zone A, insert number 1 through 30 here. And all of those Zone A1 through 30 will eventually be changed over into just a Zone AE. And that is an inland special flood hazard area, which includes the base flood elevations, and sometimes it can include a floodway along rivers or streams. There are also, for inland floodplain zones, there's an AO zone, which is an area of shallow flooding with a depth between 1 and 3 feet. And then coastal zones also have their own convention, VE, which is known as the coastal high hazard area, affected by waves higher than 3 feet. And these VE zones do include base flood elevations. So here is a screenshot I took of an area in Rye where there are 6 different flood zones in this one picture. So first thing to note, everything in blue is considered the special flood hazard area, or that 1% annual chance flood area. Then we also have up on near the top of the image, a brown kind of orangey color. This is the 0.2% annual chance flood area, formerly known as the 500-year floodplain. This area, unless the community has adopted higher standards, is not development within the 0.2% annual chance flood area is not required to meet the community's floodplain management regulations. But all right, so going back to what is in the special flood hazard area. So we have multiple different zones, each with their own base flood elevation. So starting here, we have a zone AO depth 3. So that means that to determine your base flood elevation, you would take the highest adjacent grade and add 3 feet to determine that BFE. Then we also have a VE zone. It's a little too small for me to read. I believe that's a VE zone elevation. I'm sorry, that is too small for me to read right on my screen right now. But here's one VE zone. Above it, we have another VE zone with a different elevation and a third VE zone with a different elevation. And so it is not uncommon for neighbors to be across the street from each other with different base flood elevations and different building height requirements. Alrighty, so also included in the flood insurance rate map in the coastal area is what's called the limit of moderate wave action, or LIMWA. And this is shown on the map as a line with small triangles. It is this circle area right here. And the triangles point in the direction of what is known as the coastal A zone, it's the inland limit of the area to receive 1.5 foot or higher breaking waves during the base flood, or that 1% annual chance flood. And it is referenced in the state building code and imply more stringent building requirements that go beyond the minimum NFIP requirements if you are seaward of that limit of moderate wave action. So, all right, so we've talked a bit about the base flood elevation, but specifically, it is the height to which a flood water would be expected to rise in the 1% annual chance flood event. It is not a flood depth because it is the height above sea level, not height above ground level. And on the flood insurance rate maps, the base flood elevation is rounded to the nearest whole foot. But there is more detailed base flood elevation numbers in the flood insurance study. And the base flood elevation is mostly used to determine the minimum construction elevation. On the top panel here, you can see there are cross sections along the river, which each have a number. So we start downstream with 251 feet for the base flood elevation, going up 1 foot with each of these cross sections. And so that means that at this cross section, the base flood elevation would be 253 feet above sea level. And so that does not mean that the depth of that flood is going to be 253 feet. It is, you would have to compare that with the elevation of the area that it's over to figure out what that flood depth is. But yeah, it is not a height, it is just the elevation above sea level. So We also see regulatory floodways on the flood insurance rate maps. That is this kind of striped area, which generally follows the main channel of the river. And the regulatory floodway is designated separately because it is the area that is going to discharge the largest amount of water during that base flood. And so that area is the most important to remain free of obstructions so that during the base flood, all of the flood waters can easily discharge into rivers and oceans and water bodies without obstruction from anything. So we have a diagram here on the left that kind of breaks up the floodway into different parts. So the main stream channel of the river is what we call the floodway. And then there's a flood fringe, which kind of brings, it incorporates the edge of the floodway all the way to the edge of that 100-year floodplain or the 1% annual chance flood area. And so yeah, this diagram kind of breaks up how you have a flood, how a floodplain is kind of broken up into different areas depending on the magnitude of the water received during a base flood. Alrighty, so I want to talk about how to determine the base flood elevation because that is a key thing to know if you are a community official reviewing building permits to ensure that all development within the floodplain is compliant. So the first thing to note when you are trying to determine a base flood elevation is the maps were, it depends on, sorry, there are different elevation or vertical datums used depending on how old your community's floodplain maps are. So if your community has maps that predate 1988, then odds are your flood insurance rate maps will be using the NGVD 29 vertical datum, whereas newer maps are using the NAVD 88 vertical datum. So if you are trying to determine if a base flood elevation, or rather if a community's construction, or if a homeowner is constructing compliant, then you just want to note which vertical datum is used in the flood insurance study and the flood insurance rate map, and then compare the base flood elevation based off of that same vertical datum. Okay, so determining the base flood elevation is going to be dependent on what flood zone you are looking at. So in general, you will likely need to look at the flood insurance study for determining a base flood elevation. And just because I haven't really gone in depth about the flood insurance study, I'll do that right here. So it is a technical report that accompanies the maps and includes details about the flood analysis used to prepare the maps, as well as important tables, charts, that include the base flood elevation information. So for most inland AE zones, which are the most common flood zones, the flood insurance study report is going to include more precise base flood elevation data than what is on the map, because the map is rounded to the nearest whole foot. So you always want to check your flood insurance study to see if it has a more accurate base flood elevation. And the flood insurance study also has something called the Summary of Stillwater Elevation Table, which is a list of lakes and ponds and some coastal areas. And it includes the elevations, the base flood elevation for those ponds and lakes. It also will have flood profiles, which is a graph that shows the elevation of the river bed as well as the elevation of the base flood. And there's different cross sections as you go upstream the river. Upstream on the river that will be marked on the flood insurance on the flood profile. That can also be in the floodway data table, which will list out the names of each of those cross sections, and then you can compare what the exact base flood elevation on that cross section is. So here is an example of the floodway data table. So as I was saying, there are different cross sections and they're each named on the flood insurance rate map. So this cross section right here is named AL. And so you can go into the floodway data table and look for the cross section AL. And then you would just go all the way over to the regulatory base flood. And then that would provide you with the most accurate base flood elevation for a structure at that cross section. Now, what if you're trying to determine a base flood elevation that's not exactly on a cross section? Well, in that case, you would actually want to measure the distance with a ruler from the point that you're trying to determine a base flood elevation to the nearest cross section. And then on the map, there should be a scale, and you can convert that in the measurement into how much distance that is. And then you would go over to the flood profile and you would look at the nearest cross section and go over however many feet you calculated using the map. And then you would go straight up to determine what that base flood elevation is. So I know that's a little complicated. And if you're ever having trouble figuring this out, please feel free to contact Stephanie and I. We're very willing to help you through it. Alrighty, so we talked about the still water elevation table. So here's an example of Adams Pond in Derry, where there's a pond and the base flood elevation is actually shown here on the map, but sometimes, well, on the map, it is shown as 327 feet. If you go to this summary of stillwater elevation table, that would show you it's 73 or 327.3 feet. So you just want to make sure, even if you're looking at a pond on the map and it will be to the nearest whole foot, just always double check the still water elevation table to see if there's a more accurate base flood elevation there. So determining the base flood elevation in coastal areas that are also still considered in the AE zone. So similar to the last slide, sometimes for these AE coastal zones, the map will actually show a base flood elevation value that will be rounded to the nearest whole foot. But again, you always want to double check that still water elevations table and see if there is a more accurate base flood elevation. And if there are two, there's one on the map and one in the flood insurance study, you want to use the higher of the two. And FEMA has a good introduction to coastal flood mapping, which I included the link here if you wanted to review that for your reference. There you go. Alrighty, so coastal VE zones are actually super easy um, because generally the elevation will be just listed right on the map and you can just take that as is. So it's a little difficult to read, but I believe this one is elevation 17 feet. So for anything in this zone, you would be determining that the base flood elevation is 17 feet. All right, so zone A, I've kind of talked about this a little bit, but there's a couple ways that you can determine a base flood elevation for these because there is no base flood elevation on the map or in the flood insurance study. So you can use any federal, state, or other source of BFE data available, which can include an elevation certificate provided by the applicant. And generally, that can be costly and cost prohibitive for an applicant to pay for the study themselves. So if there's a financial uh, if there's a financial barrier towards that, we do have the workaround of establishing the BFE as 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade of the building site. All right, so AO zones, we've talked about this in the example I showed earlier, where the AO zones will have the depth of the flooding in feet shown on the map. And they don't have an actual base flood elevation. So to determine that base flood elevation, you would take the highest adjacent grade plus the depth that is shown on the flood insurance rate map. So in this example here, we have an AO zone depth 1. So your base flood elevation would be the highest adjacent grade plus 1 foot. Alrighty, so lastly, I'm going to talk about how to view the maps and where you can get them. So all communities should have paper copies of the maps, or at least the ability to create a paper copy for someone if they request it. And copies of the map panels and FIS reports are available for viewing or download on the FEMA Map Service Center for all National Flood Insurance Program communities. There is also the the National Flood Changes Viewer. That is a great resource to use if you are trying to see what the preliminary maps look like. I will say that one does take up a lot of bandwidth, so it can be if you don't have a great internet connection, that website can be a little hard to load. Alternatively, we also have the National Flood Hazard Layer, which that one will only show current effective maps, and your community has to have digitized maps to be able to view maps on that website. And then you can also download GIS data from the Map Service Center, and your community may use that GIS data to create your own community map viewer within with the FEMA floodplains shown. So here is the link to the Map Service Center. This is where you'll be able to download non-digitized maps. You can download preliminary map panels. This is the main go-to website that FEMA hosts. And then here's what the National Flood Hazard Layer looks like. This is an ArcGIS application, and here I've got it zoomed in on Concord right now, and so you can see the Merrimack River with the floodway mapped out, as well as all the blue areas being the special flood hazard area. And then these orange brown areas are the 0.2% annual chance flood area, also known as the 500-year floodplain. Sorry, my cursor froze for a minute. Okay, and then here's what the flood map changes viewer looks like. So this is a great resource to keep up to date with what the preliminary maps are looking like if your community is in the process of getting new maps. It can be a little difficult to understand what is going on here, but I will in a couple slides kind of explain this. So currently, FEMA is in the process of updating pretty much all of the floodplain maps in the state. We've already had the Pemigewasset River watershed in Grafton County go effective in 2024. And then this coming up in January, we will have the Merrimack watershed of Merrimack County go effective. And the new maps are created through what's called FEMA's risk map process. It is a multi-year process following about 9 basic steps, and it can last 3 to 5 years from the start of the process to the end. And until the new maps become effective and published at the very end of this process, communities still must be following your current effective maps because those are the legal maps. But yeah, I have a link here to this FEMA risk map process on our website, which kind of explains all the different steps in more detail. But it essentially starts with the data collection for the first 1 to 2 years, and then the years 2 to 3 are preliminary map development, where a community will receive preliminary maps. There will be an appeal period where the community can submit surveying data to dispute any maps, and then FEMA will provide revised maps. And eventually, um, once the maps are finalized, the community will receive a letter of final determination, and that starts the 6-month period where the community has 6 months from the date of that LFD to adopt the new maps. And here at the Office of Planning and Development, we are working with the communities and FEMA to make sure that any ordinance updates that are required are done the year before. You guys should be getting a letter of final determination to make sure that there's no updates that are needed in the ordinance, and or if there are updates, those can be made during the normal town hall town hall dates, so no communities get stuck in a situation where you don't have a town hall for the next 6 months, but you do have to update the new maps. All right, so we've got a lot of different mapping projects happening in the state. They are broken up by watershed, not by county. And so sometimes you have one county with 3 or 4 watersheds. Or sometimes you have a watershed that takes up an entire county. But here's a list of the different watersheds that are currently active. Or currently have an active FEMA mapping process going on. And we do have a current mapping projects webpage on our website. We do have a new website coming, so this link will likely change in the future. And we are working on getting all of the watersheds up to date with the most recent updates that we've gotten from FEMA. All right. So um, I just wanted to highlight what can change or what the preliminary maps can look like before and after. So this is taken over in Webster, New Hampshire, and this is a screenshot of what the current existing floodplain maps looks like. So we've got the main river here and with a very large floodplain expanse on either side of the river and with a general outline. Like this is a pretty smooth boundary for the floodplain. But the preliminary maps show a lot more detail, and that's due to the fact that we have a lot better surveying technology now that can have a lot more accurate measurements and can lead to a lot more accurate modeling for um, the base flood. So um, gonna go back and forth a little bit here. So you can see that all of these purple areas have been actually removed from the floodplain because the new modeling and the new elevation technology allows us to firmly show that these areas are not actually subject to that 100-year flood, whereas these yellow areas are being added um, to the floodplain. So yeah, you can see that we have a lot more detail now and a lot better science behind creating the maps. And so the maps are going to look a lot more detailed. And there may be significant changes to your community's floodplain with these new maps. So I just wanted to emphasize, like, do not be surprised if your floodplain maps look significantly different from the current maps. But ultimately, these new maps should be a lot more accurate to current development and water cycles. Okay, so we're just going to wrap up. I know it's been a long presentation today, and we thank you for your patience. But I know that was a lot of information. So today's webinar was supposed to be just main basics community officials should be aware of. So the key takeaways that we want you to leave today with are to become familiar with your community's floodplain maps and just know what your flood insurance study and report looks like, know how to access that, know how to make a base flood elevation determination or know the resources to use to do so. Also check out, well, we have the FEMA's National Flood Hazards layer. Currently, New Hampshire, or we do have a New Hampshire Flood Hazards viewer, but access to that, that website is currently broken and we're in the process of fixing that to get that back up and running. But yeah, FEMA has a National Flood Hazards viewer that is almost, it's very, very similar to the one that we have here in New Hampshire. We also want to make sure that you guys are staying informed and participating in any FEMA mapping projects happening in your community. And also have an effective permit and enforcement process for all development in the special flood hazard area. Develop good administrative procedures to ensure adherence, consistency, and maintain good NFIP standing. If you have questions about enforcement, permitting, and administrative procedures, I highly recommend you attend our December 2nd training on best practices for enforcement and procedures, because we'll go into a lot more detail on that training. And then lastly, we've got, we just want to make sure you guys are understanding the floodplain regulations and are familiar with the guidance and resources available. And please feel free to contact Stephanie and I at the Office of Planning and Development. We are the Floodplain Management Program team. And part of our work is to be available for assistance. All right, so I will be sending these slides out to you guys after today. And so we've got a list of resources here, but we've got 5 minutes left, which sorry, we didn't leave terribly long for questions, but I've seen some people are putting questions in the chat and the Q&A. So please feel free to ask any questions.
Sarah,
So,
maybe we can start with a question from Henry. I can ask it, or Henry, you can unmute yourself. But the question was about whether there's specific standards or a model for the 1% flood and what it's based off of, if it's for an hour, a day, a week.
I do not know what the source model behind the hydrologic studies is, but it is a probability. And I don't think it is specifically trying to look at the 1% chance flood for an hour. Like, I don't think it's looking at a particular time frame. I I can, if you have a question, please email or sorry. If you want to know more, please email me or Stephanie, and we can get you in contact with the people at FEMA that actually do the modeling, because they know a lot more about what actually goes into the determination of that flood modeling.
Thank you. We also got a question in the chat from Amber. What are the most relevant courses at Emmitsburg, Virginia, aka FEMA camp, that would help us at local building inspectors and potential CFMs?
So that's a great question. The courses at FEMA have been a little inconsistent, or they've been a little bit inconsistent, but the main one that we recommend everyone take is the EL 273 course. That is the course that's required for becoming a CFM. There is also the Association for State Floodplain Managers, that's ASFPM. They have a ton of trainings and a CFM preparation course that you can take online. That is not a FEMA camp, but it is the certifying agency for floodplain managers. And so I do recommend a lot of their courses too. And their website is just floods.org. So it's very easy to remember, or you can just search for ASFPM trainings. And yeah, they have a wide variety of trainings that you can take online at your own time. I know the FEMA 273 course is typically an in-person course that is a scheduled thing that you would likely need to travel to. So yeah, there's many different options out there for education.
I'm not
All right.
seeing any other questions.
Well, if you have any other questions, please continue to put them in the chat or the Q&A, or if not, or if you want to think about it some more, please feel free to reach out to Stephanie or I after this, and we'd be happy to provide any assistance or point you towards any resources that we think would be helpful. But I would like to thank everybody for coming to the training today. We're going to wrap it up. We're right at 11:30. But I encourage anyone to hop on to and register for our December 2nd training for best practices, because that one will be very helpful for new floodplain managers at the community level. All right, well, thank you, everybody. And I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday.